Welcome to a special holiday edition of Power and Politics. I'm David Cochrane. 2023 saw some dramatic swings in party support. Polls suggest the Conservatives have pulled ahead of the Liberals and could win a majority government if an election was held tomorrow. But an election isn't scheduled until 2025, and it only happens earlier than that if the NDP-Liberal deal falls apart or if the Liberals pull the plug themselves. So what's in store for 2024? To dive into the year ahead and check the political pulse of those three political parties, I'm joined by our three party insiders. Greg MacEachern is a former Liberal ministerial staffer and now with CAN Strategies. Melanie Richer, former Director of Communications in the New Democratic Party and now a senior consultant with Earnscliffe Strategies. And Fred DeLorey, former Conservative campaign manager and partner at North Star Public Affairs. Happy holidays, gang. Good to see you all. Now, during this show, we're going to assess the state of each of your parties and then pick some issues to watch in 2024. So let's start with the governing Liberals.
The world is going through change, and we need to make sure that this change benefits Canadians. Conservative politicians are arguing that Canada needs to do less to fight climate change.
I always say we could have moved faster. Absolutely, there's always more to do.
So we can get building more homes, increasing supply, and lowering the prices for families. We know times are challenging, but this is the team that is going to be able to continue the hard work. Even though we have a lot of work to do, Canada is not broken.
So what could the next year look like for the Liberals? Greg, I guess you're hoping better, in a word? I mean, what are you anticipating in 2024?
Why would you say that, David?
No, it's been a great 2023.
Everything was fine. You referred to some just month after month of really bad polling for the Liberals. And at some point, how did that break through into the inner caucus, the inner cabinet, the inner circle? Liberals, rank and file across the country were certainly feeling some despair as they noticed the polling, but there was a feeling that the Liberals were not responding. A lot of conversations about whether or not they should have been responding with advertising. But as 2023 went on, there were some glimpses of hope in December. There were a lot of own goals by the Liberals, but the Conservatives had a few own goals on themselves late November, December, and some suggestions that the polls may not be as locked in or baked in as first thought.
Mel, it sounds like Greg and other Liberals want to see a bit more fight in 2024 than they saw maybe from the party stalwarts in 2023.
For sure. I think what we saw in 2023 was the Liberals did not define Pierre Poilievre. They didn't define the Conservative Party, so it allowed Pierre Poilievre to define himself. But what we also maybe didn't see from the Liberal is a narrative that they stuck to throughout the year. Instead, what people saw was a government that was responding to the crises of the day, but they were unable to get ahead of them. So they were unable to get ahead of what was happening and unable to punch through with what they were offering people. And I know when you're government, you do have to respond to what's happening from day to day, but you should still be able to punch through on a message. And folks at home should be able to understand what that message is, and I think we saw a lack of that in 2023 in a way that seemed like the Liberals were almost lost a little bit.
Yeah, Fred, there was sort of a failure, as Mel describes it, to define Pierre Poilievre, but also to define the issues, and set the agenda, and Poilievre just drove the narrative as a result. How did the Liberals do better in 2024?
Yeah, I think, well, as Melanie said, they need a narrative, they need a story to tell, and to tie all of the things together that they've been doing. We've seen glimpses of it, right? Like they've got some policies that they seem to be getting these wins on, but they're not telling the story. We saw the child poverty stats that came out a few weeks ago that were phenomenal, and I had to go basically look for that, or someone had to send it to me. It wasn't really out there. They weren't saying it themselves. They're not telling their story.
A dramatic reduction in child poverty for people at home, like 27% reduction in child poverty. Yeah.
And there's lots of different things they could package together, and they need that overarching narrative to tell. And again, we've seen these glimpses. You can see it's forming. Trudeau was strong at the convention in the spring. He had a good message there, and then it kind of disappeared for a while. And we're seeing in December, the end of the session here, it started popping up again. They started at least trying to put something together, and I think in the future we're going to see this finally come together.
Greg, there's the message, and you need kind of the proof points, and on the big issues like of affordability and housing, like we are seeing inflation coming down. We may get interest rate cuts in the new year. Sean Fraser's crafting a housing narrative out there. But the messenger is very important. And 2024 feels like a critical year for Justin Trudeau, even though he says he's determined to stay on to 2025 and run the next election. What do you think? Where do you think he is?
Yeah, and I think they're obviously you're going to pivot to your strengths. And for the Liberal Party, Justin Trudeau was the brand, 2015, 2019, absolutely. But I think back to the Chrétien era, just for comparisons. If you were a blue Liberal, you were on the business side, you had John Manley and Paul Martin. If you were on the left side of the party, you had Sheila Copps. There was a lot to put in the window there. And the Liberals had to come to that realization. You saw who the performers were and who were rewarded. For example, the cabinet shuffle, Karina Gold and Sean Fraser were two that were given promotions. But if we were talking this time last year, we might have still been talking about the backlog in immigration, backlog in passports. And I remember in January hearing from a friend in government that the passport backlog had been basically eliminated. And to Fred's point about not talking about what you've done, they had to be kind of prodded and reminded, you should tell people that the passport in January of this year, the passport backlog was pretty much gone. Right. So what I see is you see more cabinet ministers out there like Seamus O'Regan, the aforementioned Sean Fraser and Karina Gold, Mark Miller. You see more of them, and that's a good thing when you're trying to face, going into your fourth election. You may want to be presenting the team. You don't have the luxury when you're in government of being able to always pick the narrative. You have to respond to world events. Who knew what was going to happen on October 7th when we started off this year? However, again, to refer to what Fred just said, you've got to find people who can help connect the narrative. This is leadership in tough times, whatever that narrative is, but you need to be able to connect it for folks.
But, Mel, there's sort of that drifting narrative throughout the year that you highlighted, and sort of the despondency in the party over the low polling numbers. In December, things did feel to lift off a little bit. Galvanized, the caucus was in a lot of ways by the filibuster and sensing mistakes by the Conservatives that they capitalize on. Did you see something from them at the end of the year that maybe they can carry into 2024? Right.
They seem to be just a little bit more strong. They seemed a little bit less lost than they had been maybe in the months leading up to it. I don't know that that's totally because the Liberals have decided what their thing is, or because Pierre Poilievre had a few bad moments that they, rallied around and decided to all punch in the same direction. But I would maybe disagree a little bit with what Greg was just saying about the different voices. I think these days, when you're running an election, your leader is really important. And we've seen in recent elections, I'm thinking of Manitoba, where when you ask others to be that voice, people don't always know what they're voting for. So I think in the lead up to the next election, when the Conservatives are so focused on Pierre Poilievre because he's doing so well for them, I think it'll be important actually that Justin Trudeau is kind of brought back to where he was in last elections. And, he's scrappy. He's usually really good at elections, so that's an opportunity for them. But I think he needs to be focused, and he needs to be able to deliver a message.
Fred, the Prime Minister has historically performed his best when he's at his worst. He's facing an enormous challenge. But I wonder if after 8 years and going into this, if there's an oversaturation, and that's going to make it hard, to sort of wring out the sponge of public opinion and start over. What do you think? How do they approach that?
It's very hard with him because he's been the face of what's really a positive brand, right? They play positive politics. They play very dirty behind the scenes. Like I've been the victim of that as a campaigner for the Conservatives. But the leader, the spokesperson, has generally been very positive. I think they're learning he's actually also their best weapon, and times have change. And right now, we talked about their narrative, the positive they need to be pushing. There's the contrast, and that's what I think we really saw in the last in December and the end of November was them really sharpening their sticks at Poilievre.
Well, as a wise man once said, it's power and politics, not politics and feelings, right, Fred? So, Greg, on that,
the line of the year,
the Liberals have, tried to cling to the sunny ways thing, which I don't know if it works with an angry country and a three-term prime minister seeking term number 4 and an opponent like Pierre Poilievre. Do they need to sort of chuck that out and adapt to the new reality if they're going to get back into this before the 2025 campaign?
On sunny ways, one of the issues that I had with it in the first term, especially in question period, Liberal ministers never decided not to remind former, Conservative cabinet ministers, former Conservative government and MPs under Harper, of things that they did. And very quickly, Conservatives thought, we've got a free pass here. It's like there's amnesia. So by 2019, they weren't even wearing their own record because the Liberals weren't reminding them of that. And that helped them. That helped them in 2015. It didn't really help them in 2019, post-SNC-Lavalin. There were a lot of issues with that. And again, it's the same way that we defend negative advertising when we describe it as, well, it's a contrasting ad. It's not really negative, or it's their record. There's nothing that's false about it. But it is challenging. And again, I do think I take Mel's point about the Manitoba election, but you had someone who had no record of being in government, and it's very different when you're.
He was the change.
Yeah. If you're asking for your fourth term, you've got to come up with a different sales line.
It'll be interesting to see how they marry extreme right-wing MAGA-style politics with the Sunny Ways narrative of the past. Okay, so a lot of uncertainty ahead for the Liberals. Up next, we're going to talk about the Conservatives and what they could have in store in 2024. Stay right there. Welcome back to this special holiday edition of Power and Politics. We're looking at what's in store for Canadian politics in 2024. We just took a look at the Liberal fortunes. Now, what could be in store for the Conservatives? Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre shaped and drove the political narrative in 2023, and as a result, his party dominated the polls this year. But as the cliche goes, the only poll that matters is Election Day. So can the Conservatives sustain this lead until that next election?
We're going to bring homes you can afford by building those homes. We will remind people every day in every way that we are the only common sense party with a plan to bring home the Canada that we know and love.
Why won't they stop sending Canadians the bill and let Canadians afford to eat, heat, and house themselves?
Everything's broken after 8 years of Trudeau. But the good news is life was not like this before Justin Trudeau, and it won't be like this after he's gone.
When I'm Prime Minister, I will only do things that workers and consumers have been convinced are good for them. There will be a carbon tax election. I will win the carbon tax election, and whether you like it or not, I will axe the tax.
Okay, back with me are our political insiders, Greg MacEachern, Melanie Richer, and Fred DeLorey. Fred, let's start with you. By every metric, 2023 was a good year for the Conservatives. They've surged to a double-digit lead in most polls by the end of the year. Their fundraising numbers are way ahead, and they're driving the narrative. How do they keep that going into 2024?
You're going to see exactly what they've been doing. Poilievre is going to stay true to who he is. He's going to keep going super aggressive throughout the year. We saw some of the digital media dominance in the videos they put out. I bet we're going to see a lot more of those coming out because that was so successful. And they're going to keep getting their message out there and running, their contrast campaign against Trudeau. Right now, they had a huge advantage in 2023 being the only party out there campaigning. He's been running leadership style or general election style tours of the country, going around to every region. We're also going to see, I think, a lot of great candidates coming forward that he's been recruiting. And I think it's going to be, 2024 could be just as well as 2023 was, and maybe that lead will continue to grow if they're the only political party campaigning. So we'll see what the other parties do to try to catch up.
So Mel, on that, the laser focus on a small group of issues, right, has really been sort of at the core of the success. Affordability, housing, carbon tax, these sorts of things. If affordability and these things start to ease, how does that potentially change the strategy, you think, for the Conservatives going ahead?
Right. Well, it'll be harder to, if that changes, if affordability changes and people are feeling less squeezed or they're feeling their budgets less squeezed, I think it'll be harder to tap into people's anger, and people will be looking for more than just, everything's broken. Actually, I'm doing okay right now. So he's going to need to pivot a little bit and be able to be more propositional. Here is how my vision of what Canada looks like is different, and this is how things can continue to get better. And I think instead of just saying things aren't working, maybe take a little bit of credit because he's been talking about this for the last year. So we could see a switch like that. But if the economy changes and people are feeling less squeezed, for sure, everybody's message really will have to adapt. But because Pierre Poilievre has been able to push that message the strongest, I think he's the one who's going to have to do the most adjusting.
Greg, where do you see it going for Pierre Poilievre and the front-running Conservatives next year?
They have to make a decision on who is the Pierre Poilievre, who's their leader. If you were to take a photo of him from this time last year and this year, it'd be like one of those old makeover TV shows when you had them side by side, because he physically looks different. Why did they feel the need to do that? They ran ads that talked about how nice he is and he's a family man, but his own actions were really quite the opposite of that. So, they spent a lot of money on those ads, rebranding him. And I would argue that those ads were very successful if you look at the polling. People were willing to give him a chance. At the end of the year, though, his negatives spiked up really high. And it was after he blamed reporters for making him say the word terrorism after the incident at the bridge in Niagara Falls. He got into a verbal argument with a couple of reporters. The things like firing the Bank of Canada head, those are not things that kind of reconcile with the image. So there is a bit of disconnect between who they tried to present to us, who he was, and who he actually was. And it seems like the more Canadians saw the real Conservative leader, and again, there were not a lot of polls near the end of the year that showed this, but it seemed like the more Canadians saw that side of the Conservative leader, the less they liked.
So Fred, on that, because you said we can expect to see Pierre Poilievre continue to be true to who he is, which is a high-energy guy with very strong beliefs and a focus on a core set of issues. And the downside is he's a high-energy guy with a core set of beliefs and a laser focus on a very specific set of issues. And sometimes that gets him into conflict, or, for example, the opposition to the carbon tax led to the controversy on Ukraine because of the free trade agreement, right? So how do they guard against that, or do they? Do they just think it's working?
A 10-point lead is still a 10-point lead. He's got a massive lead. I don't think there's going to be any adjustment on that. They will keep introducing him to Canadians, I bet, with positive ads, and keep pushing stuff out from time to time. But he got and built to where he is by being aggressive. And on the point about policy changing and if affordability shifts, he could take partial credit for that, but at the same time, he'll just find other issues too to champion because he's so effective at driving the message and owning it. He's owned the Liberals for the last year, and I don't see what would change that. Whatever policies are in front of him, he will find that contrast because he is an animal of politics, something that we've never quite seen in my lifetime here.
Right. So Mel, on that, there's a lot of anger in the country and a lot of divisions in the country, and the Liberals would argue that Mr. Poilievre is fomenting that. It seems to me more he's speaking to it and capitalizing on it, right? Because his instincts and his messaging, complement the vibe that's out there. Right. What makes him so effective on that? How is it he's been able to build this 10-point lead that Fred is pointing to?
He speaks very simple, right? He speaks to people in a way that they understand, and his what he's proposing is very simple, and it's something that people can understand. Whereas when you're faced with what the Liberals and what the NDP are proposing, it's a little bit more complicated or a little bit more nuanced. And when you have a very simple message and a message that's a little bit more nuanced, of course the simple message is going to be more effective at resonating with people. And I think also to the point that we were talking about earlier when we were talking about the Liberals have been unable to say, I know you're having a hard time, here's what we're doing to make it better. They just go to here's what we're doing to make it better. So in the contrast, when Pierre Poilievre is able to tap into the way that people are feeling in a real way, I think people feel heard and understood more than the government has been able to do.
Right. Greg, my sense in some of the challenges with the Liberals in their communications is there's kind of a defensiveness of it's not as bad as you say. Look at direct foreign investment, for example. And while Poilievre sort of speaks to the anger and frustration of people, there's an opportunity there for the government to speak with empathy that they've kind of missed, it seems, and that's allowed him to fill the whole space, right?
Yeah, it's the old saying that it takes a carpenter to build a barn, but any idiot can burn it down. It's really easy to go after anger, but it's short-lived and it's a bit dangerous. They're also trying to appeal to Max Bernier supporters, and that's what got them into trouble on Ukraine. They were, at the last week the House sat, they were trying to find ways to, some of the MPs, to do over their votes on the Ukraine free trade deal and on Operation Unifier. And as we've said many times on this panel, If you're explaining, you're losing.
Yeah.
And the Conservatives were left trying to explain why at the same time Republicans in the United States were turning their backs on Ukraine, seeming to support Putin and Russia, why they were doing the same thing at the same time. And I know it made a lot of Conservative MPs really uncomfortable. Yes, a 10-point lead can keep you quiet for a while, but only to a certain point.
So, Fred, your response to that, but also Greg's point that anger can be short-lived. In normal times, I think that would be true. I'm not sure these are normal times. Right. And I know one of the things Liberals are very worried about is that not everybody's renewed their mortgage yet. And even if interest rates start to go down, they'll still be higher than they were before. And that's a whole new cohort of people cycling into that anger, because even as affordability gets better, the mortgages for multi-years, and that is an increased cost they're going to have to deal with, right? So this is the opportunity for Poilievre. Right?
This is perfect timing for Poilievre to be leader of the Conservative Party, where he has this aggressive ability to communicate and go out and to feed into that anger and to channel it. Because if you look back, from the pandemic, this is what's caused all this. This is what's coming out of it. If Poilievre was leader in 19, as I've said before, I think he could have won that election. If he was leader in 21, he would have got crushed because he wouldn't have fit what Canadians were looking at.
Right.
But right now, he is the perfect leader for the perfect time, for the moment and the movement that's out there.
But to Greg's point on the risk of because Jenny Byrne, who's running a lot of their political operations, has said publicly in the past, going after the Bernier voters is a key part of winning for the Conservatives. Ukraine seems to be part of that. Raising vaccine mandates with Joe Biden seems to be part of that. Is there a risk in that strategy going ahead into 2024?
There is a risk, and I was a national campaign manager for the last election, so I saw this when the PPC went up. And our view of it then, and I would hold it now, is if you go after that vote too aggressively, you're losing the middle. Yeah. So Poilievre seems to be doing that, though, but still holding the middle. But there is that risk that the middle will eventually cave on him if he's not careful with this.
Totally.
Okay, we're going to leave that one there. We've looked into our crystal balls for the Liberals and the Conservatives. What could the NDP have in store for 2024? Stick around and find out. That's next. Welcome back to this special holiday edition of Power and Politics. Today we're looking at what's in the magic 8 ball for Canadian politics in the year ahead. We've gone over the Liberals and the Conservatives. Now, what's in store for the NDP in 2024?
We don't agree with the Liberals' divisive tactics. We don't agree with the climate denial of the Conservatives. We have our own path. We've seen 8 years of this Liberal government not really take this seriously. They haven't addressed this problem. The agreement gives us the ability to negotiate and force this government to do more. Unlike the Conservatives, whose goal is just to force an election, our goal is to force this government to work for people. Pierre Poilievre claims that everything in this country is broken. On the other hand, Justin Trudeau wants you to think that everything is fine. He thinks that paying $40 for chicken is fine. It's not fine. It's not normal. Can New Democrats deliver real programs that make people's lives better? The answer is now yes. We can take that to Canadians. We can deliver. We can make things happen that give people a break.
All right, back with me are our political insiders, Greg MacEachern and Melanie Richer, Fred DeLorey. And Mel, we're going to start with you. I would say that the end of 2023 was the best for Jagmeet Singh of all the other leaders because he welcomed his second child into the world. But in terms of, other than like having twice as many kids to deal with, what's he got on his plate for 2024?
For sure. I think it's continuing to push the government to do more and being able to take credit for that. I think the big challenge for the NDP going into the next election will be to make sure that the things that people are seeing come in, like dental care, like some of the housing measures, know that actually those things are happening because New Democrats push them to make them happen. If they don't know that, well, I think it'll be challenging for Jagmeet going into the next one. So like Pierre Poilievre does a little bit, he needs to tap into that anger, but turn it towards hope, which is a little bit different than Pierre Poilievre. So continue to tap into what people are feeling, the frustration that they're feeling, and show some empathy with the plans that he has to make things better will be what I expect to see from Jagmeet in the next year, but also I think what the party needs to do in the lead up to the next election.
Greg, we saw the rollout of the dental plan, the announcement at its shape, it'll roll out over 2024 before the end of the year. Pharmacare not done making progress, delayed until March. Is confidence and supply working politically for the NDP? I know they're getting some policy successes here, but do you think this is a benefit for them?
Well, to be really cynical, usually what Liberals do is we wait till the election, steal the NDP idea, and then we run on it, according to some critics.
Now you're just doing it early?
Now we're doing it early. No, we're doing it openly. But you know, that your question is really best aimed at, you know, the powers that be in the NDP. This is a huge gift. You know, my cynicism aside, this is one where they get full credit for this. This isn't, you know, another party trying to dust off and repackage an NDP policy idea. It is their idea.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good idea.
Dental, you mean?
Yeah. I think, you know, in terms of its impacts on positive healthcare all the way around, and just some changes that have happened in Canada over the last 20, 30 years, I think this is a huge impact. I think it's something that they'll be able to talk about for a long time. But the challenge for them is to be able to do that. Liberals often, you know, watching Question Period, you know, they'll get a really tough, nasty question from the NDP, and they are not responding in kind because they know they need to keep this going. The challenge for the NDP leader, it's kind of like what Fred said earlier about, you know, if Pierre Poilievre had run in 2019 versus 21. This is an entirely different world post-pandemic. We're seeing things in provincial politics in Canada, like Legault's numbers have really dropped. So the type of person that he was seen to be before was, you know, everyone thinks that he's super nice. People question about how serious he is. He's got serious MPs around him, like Peter Julian, Daniel Blakey. And as what I said earlier about the team, that might not be a bad approach for the New Democrats as well. Because if they are not running for first place in the next election, they need to be running about what they contributed, you know, during this election. So they don't end up like the NDP in 74.
But Fred, they always sound like the most disappointed political partner ever, you know, that they never agree with what the government is doing, but they always support what the government is doing, right? Because let's face it, nobody other than your crowd wants an election right now. So how do they, you know, move the needle a bit more in 2024? Because the farmmaker thing is delayed, and there may not be a full meeting of the minds on that particular one.
Well, look, I think when it comes down to it, the NDP have to realize who their opponent really is. It's not the Conservatives. Like we saw Jagmeet going after Poilievre a lot. Trudeau's ultimately his opponent if he wants to get anywhere. That's the one standing in their way. And we're seeing the increased polarization in the U.S. and their politics, and it's here in Canada now. The Conservatives have moved to the right, the Liberals have moved to the left. Well, there's two left-wing parties there occupying that one spot. So I don't know how that is going to hold up in the future. You know, we've been saying this for decades and decades. Why is there two parties, like potentially progressive parties on the left? But the Liberal Party's actually moved there now. They've got it
in 2015. They just went there.
They used to be a centrist party, right? We talked about Chrétien and Martin and those guys in Manly earlier. The blue Liberals, they don't exist anymore. The reason why he doesn't have them around them, because they're not around. There's no one here. The party is a left-wing party now. So now we have two left-wing parties competing for the same vote, which, of course, as a Conservative, I love it because it's going to help us come up right up the middle and win the next election. Yeah,
I mean, your point is right. I mean, there are geographic battles, Northern Ontario, Southwestern Ontario, you know, interior of British Columbia, where it is an orange-blue battle. But, you know, Mel, on that point, this polarization Fred talks about seems real. And if Prime Minister Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre are both there in 2025, as they both say they're going to be, it feels like we're going to have the most polarized election outside of Quebec, certainly in English Canada, maybe ever. Where does the NDP fit into a political dynamic like that?
Right. I think that there's an opportunity for the NDP to actually, to your point, not just go after Pierre Poilievre, but to also go after Justin Trudeau in a way where you can say, look, this guy was not going to do any of the things he did this year unless we were there to push him to do it. He will not help you the way that you need to be helped. He doesn't understand what you're going through, and this is why we're different. So they can fight that battle with the Liberals, but where they can also fight is with the Conservatives. And I think that there is actually an opportunity there that would not exist with an Aaron O'Toole, would not even exist with an Andrew Scheer, but that is really real with Pierre Poilievre. When he's talking to workers, when he's talking about, you know, class-based issues, that is not a fight that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals can have handily with Pierre Poilievre, but it is a fight that New Democrats can have with the Conservative Party. So I think that there's an opportunity in the lead up to the next one to be able to do both those things and convince people to vote for the New Democrats in the next one.
Yeah, Greg, I look at those dynamics and I wonder if that becomes a vote split between the New Democrats and the Liberal that elects Conservatives, or if people who were New Democrat supporters and were afraid of Aaron O'Toole are going to look at Poilievre and say, I got to vote Liberal. this time. You know, I see both of those things as possibilities. Right?
Yeah, but no.
All right.
I'm going to disagree with both my colleagues here. You know, in terms of labor, you look at the amount of outreach that Seamus O'Regan has done, the way that they've handled some really tough labor negotiations over the last 6-8 months. There is a case there. And to Fred's point that, you know, the Liberal Party's on the left, I would say the Liberal Party is still a centrist party, and the centre moves. It's easy to look at Jean Chrétien when he's facing Preston Manning, demanding that the budget be balanced, and see it as, you know, blue Liberal Party or party on the right. You know, in 2015, the Liberals made a case for running on a deficit. They totally blew the NDP away with that. Mulcair was not ready for that, and they were able to win. And then it's really hard to judge when we've gone through a worldwide pandemic and we've had to put money out the door so that people could actually survive. Is that on the left? Probably. Was it the right thing to do? Absolutely. So I'm not so sure that the Liberal Party is entirely on the left. And you see that with, you know, some of the cabinet ministers that we're starting to see kind of emerge now that the focus isn't entirely on the Prime Minister. Industry Minister Champagne can't leave, you know, an event without going around the room collecting business cards, trying to find ways to promote business in Canada. That does not sound like a leftist agenda.
But it's because he's got big subsidies to offer, which is a progressive kind of leftist agenda economically.
Fair enough,
right?
but,
you know?
but they also have to have an economy that they have to rebuild.
Right.
The stronger the economy, hopefully the better the mood that Canadians will be in.
Right. So Fred, the New Democrats in this dynamic then in 2024, what do they need to do beyond sort of like forcing Trudeau to deliver on the commitments in the confidence and supply agreement? Like what are the sort of larger political plays that Singh and company can make to move the needle in their direction?
Well, it's to get part of the deal actually done. There's things that keep getting delayed, and they're still propping up this government. So they're propping them up and not getting all of the achievements that were at least promised. You know, I mean, a few months ago we had these stories that pharmacare is supposed to be done by Christmas. It's not. So they've got to start actually getting the stuff done. Politically, though, they need to outperform the Liberals in some way. They need to jump them. They're, you know, tight with the number of polls. They are close there. If they start building it, I say there's a party on the left, and the NDP could get squeezed. The Liberals could get squeezed as well. They were squeezed once before Trudeau, back to 2011. They got thrown down to 35 seats. That's still possible, where one party emerges from the left.
Yeah, Mel, you know, it's a fun point. The landscape of the country. I mean, I think Greg's analysis on the shifting of the Canadian centre is probably right in a lot of ways, and you see it that, you know, the majority of Canadians do vote for quote-unquote progressive-leaning parties. But that just also creates a more competitive landscape for a party like the NDP. So how do they do the thing? Like, okay, say pharmacare gets done by March, as is the new deadline. Right. That's done. What then? What do the NDP do next?
Totally, that's a good question. Yeah. And I think it needs to be focused on how people are feeling and what could benefit them. So if the economy's still not doing well, what are we doing concretely to make sure that people are, you know, better able to afford their mortgages or better able to make ends meet? What I want to say, though, is I want to go back to the reason the NDP got into this agreement and whether that reason is being accomplished. And to your point earlier about everybody thinks that Jagmeet's a nice guy, we saw that in the last elections, right? We saw it in all the focus groups. He was the most popular leader, the person that people liked the most, but he was not the person that people thought could be prime minister. So how do you change that? This deal is an opportunity to show Jagmeet and is an opportunity to show the NDP make decisions that will benefit people in a real way as a fourth party in the news, because they are, you know, holding the Liberals to account. They're getting them to do these things. So I think if they can continue to show that they're credible, that they will make decisions that benefit people in a real way, and show that they're the ones really doing that, I think that continues to address that thing that we've all noticed needs to happen if Jagmeet were to be a real contender to be Prime Minister.
Okay, that's going to be the last word. Up next, our political insiders break down the big issues they're going to be watching for in 2024. Stay right there. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to this special holiday edition of Power and Politics. And today we've been going over what to expect in the year ahead for the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the NDP. But we're going to open the floor to our political insiders for their picks of issues to watch. Greg MacEachern, Melanie Richer, and Fred DeLorey. So Greg, what's your big pick of the issue you're watching in 2024?
The will he or won't he question around Justin Trudeau, or maybe it's Hamlet, to be or not to be. But whether, you know, he has said in year-end interviews that he is going to stick around. Not sure how else you can answer that question. But you've got to make that case to two Canadians. One is the Liberal Party, and I think this fall, I heard a lot from folks, Liberal folks, that were asking where their party was. And they slowly kept building on the housing announcements following the London caucus. And then the Prime Minister also has to tell Canadians why they deserve to give him another chance. And what I'm looking for is, we kind of have talked about it a little bit. I think Doug Ford has used this in the past, but you've got to tell Canadians that you've heard them, that you're working hard, but you're aware of what they're going through. And I think he's got to make that case to two very distinct groups of people. Liberals tend to be, right now, morale was good as in terms of caucus, as the House rose. But I think he's got a big case to make in terms of Canadians.
Yeah, he's got the internal audience, the external audience, a lot of stakeholders, and a lot of cranky stakeholders, Mel.
Totally. And the talking to both those groups of people is not easy, right? Because sometimes the message needs to be slightly different, and you don't want to be contradicting yourself in the message to a point where you start alienating one or the other. And managing a caucus that is unhappy is not an easy task either, especially when you're trying to tell electors you're ready to govern for 4 more years. So that is difficult. I think, to your point, he needs to do just a better job at it. He needs to be focused, and he needs to stick on it, not just in a way that is like responding to what's happening, but in a way that is forward-facing and telling people what he is going to do.
Fred, having worked closely with Aaron O'Toole, you have a sense of a grumpy caucus and how difficult those things can be. What's your take on Greg's pick on the will he or won't he question of the Prime Minister?
Yeah, it's the ultimate question with setting up the next election. It's the only variable we're not 100% sure of. At the end of the day, I think he's going to go, and I do think, despite the polls...
Go as in run or leave as Prime Minister?
Go into the next campaign.
Right, okay.
Bad choice of words. He is ultimately still the Liberals' best asset, despite where all the polls are, despite where people, 9, 10 years, whenever the next election is, as Prime Minister. You collect a lot of enemies over the years when you're leading a country internally in terms of different stakeholders and stuff that are upset with you. But at the end of the day, he is a great campaigner. And if they figure out that story to tell, both the pro and the contrast against your opponent, it's going to be a heck of a fight.
A great campaigner in a 6-week campaign, but it's like he's got a 2-year campaign ahead of him right now, right? So that becomes a challenge for him. Mel, what are you watching in 2024?
Yeah, so Fred mentioned it earlier, pharmacare. That's, I think, going to be big for New Democrats, but also big for, is this deal going to last? Are we going to see the NDP continue to be able to say we got the government to do something? Or is this the thing that people decide, you know what, this is no longer working? I'm paying attention to that. I know conversations are going well currently, but how that evolves over the next few weeks, how that evolves over the next few months, I think will be important as it relates to what the NDP is able to go back to voters with in the next election, but also just how is government running? Is it going to continue to run smoothly with the government being able to rely on New Democrats at committee, in the House, et cetera?
Right.
Or what happens with pharmacare, whether negotiations stop?
Fred, how do you see pharmacare as a vote mover in a campaign? Because I know we're all watching it very closely in Ottawa because it's part of the confidence supply agreement, and that there's negotiations on it. Is it something you think the country is seized with on whether it goes or not?
Not at all, no. I think it's a vote mover in the House of Commons, and that's where the Liberals need votes right now to keep their government afloat. And I think from what Melanie has educated us on this plan over the number of weeks on this show, is that all they're building right now is the framework. They're not actually putting a single dollar behind pharmacare. It feels like, is that part 2 after the next election? Is this like, are we now setting up the future agreement between the Liberals and the NDP if they're both can cobble up enough seats to defeat the Conservatives in the House of Commons?
Right. Does the carbon tax election become the pharmacare election in some ways? Or carbon tax for
in terms of moving MPs to vote to keep the Liberals afloat, I don't think actual voters outside of that are going to move much on that.
Greg, what do you think? I mean, if the NDP and the Liberals do come to some sort of an agreement here, the idea is that it would be mutually beneficial, but do you think it will be with Canadians?
What I noticed over the fall was it was almost like in the background there was let's put a little water in our wine over the issue of pharmacare. The urgency wasn't there. I know Fred mentioned a missed deadline, but no one was too exercised about the deadline. I think from the NDP point of view, they probably wanted to get the dental care deal. That was one that they really needed, and I think they wanted to have that before the end of the calendar year for sure, something that they could go back to their constituents and talk about. But again, like, I'm not sure exactly what the problem is going to be solved, because as been described, this just might be a plan for a plan. The other thing that's kind of happened, I think, in the mood of Canadians is because of the pandemic and the economy, people used to be really exercised about addressing climate change. And then as the economy went bad and it hurt them, it became something nice to have, which is really sad. There may be the same approach from parliamentarians about pharmacare, whereas when we looked at this back a few years ago, this was going to be super huge, but there are other things from an economic point of view we should be addressing first, and housing has really sucked up a lot of the oxygen politically.
Yeah, but you know, they say they're making progress, Mel. It's moved from the end of the year to the end of the fiscal year, I guess, you know, around budget time for the new deadline, you know, so we'll see where that goes. So Fred, there is another big variable in this year, and that's your pick for what you're watching in 2024.
It's huge. The U.S. election, we're heading into an election year, starting off with primaries, where we know Trump is going to be the Republican candidate, Biden's going to be the Democrat candidate. One's currently going through impeachment hearings. One's got I can't keep up with how many trials he's dealing with. But they're going to, you know, for the last year it's been simmering. It's going to explode into the news big time, and into everything we watch, everything we listen to. We're going to be inundated with U.S. politics. It's, you know, I do podcasting now. The top 50 political podcasts listened to in Canada, 45 of them are U.S. shows. It has huge impact on us. And the polarization where you have the Republicans where they are and the Democrats where they are, we're going to be inundated with ads, and this is going to be dominating our television and our radio stations, and the issues are going to amplify here. So this is going to be the main story of 2024 by far.
Yeah, Biden facing impeachment hearings with no underlying crime, and Trump facing indictments for a million crimes, seemingly, right? But you know, Greg, on this, the capacity for this election cycle to influence Canadian politics, Joe Biden winning his candidacy, probably not a big impact. It's all about Trump in terms of the spillover on the border and this MAGA-style tactic that your crowd is trying to use against the Conservatives. How do you see this playing out in the Canadian domestic political vibe?
Just from a media perspective, I mean, this has caused huge human resources repercussions at big networks like CNN and Fox News. Whereas, you know, it's such a blood sport, and the way that they covered the news ended up with massive changes, ratings up, ratings down. And we consume a lot of that media. So it does take a lot of our own airspace in terms of what we watch. There was a lot around the way that, you know, you can't say that the Trudeau government did not try to make real efforts with the Trump administration. There was a lot of, you know, Broadway diplomacy, things like that. But ultimately, you're dealing with a person that you can never count on from day to day. So again, it'll be one of those situations, I think, that Canadian government, like they did the last time, are going to have to start looking to, say, the 35 states that are our #1 trading partners.
Yeah. But Mel, just sort of like on the political volatility a Trump resurgence creates. You know, I've heard a lot of Liberals talk about how they want the federal election here to be after the U.S. election cycle, because they want Trump front of mind as they try to frame Poilievre. I mean, is that a real strategic option, or do people have a wall between those two in their attitudes?
Right. I think it would absolutely be a gift to Justin Trudeau and to the Liberals if Trump were to win in the States, because then you're talking to people, and it's so top of mind, right? It's not Trump's kinds of politics is not, you know, something in the background or something on the back burner. It is something that you are faced with every day. So I think absolutely it'll have an impact on our election if it comes afterwards. And I think while MAGA-style politics is here, while that division is in Canada, I don't dispute that for a second. I think the majority of Canadians look at what's happened in the States and they're still like, oh my God, that can't happen here. So while that is here and it is happening here, I think people are still a little bit afraid of that. So I think that would be why it would play into the, you know, the favor of the Liberals if Trump were to be elected.
Well, one of the things that, you know, we underestimate the value of is Elections Canada. For all of its challenges, I mean, the way it runs elections consistently and the ballots are the same, and there's none of the gerrymandering that we see in the United States. So there is an integrity to the process that sometimes is missing in various parts of the U.S. But Fred, what do you see as the potential spillover impacts, you know, of a Trump-Biden campaign and a potential Trump win here in Canada?
Well, we're seeing it right now. The Liberals in the last month have been hammering the Conservatives, calling them MAGA Republicans. So that's going to be amplified now with all of the ads and the billions of dollars of advertisement that's going to be happening. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that, and the Conservatives are going to have to defend themselves against that in some way.
Is that an effective strategy? Like, to me, the Trump comparison has been so overused. You know what I mean? Going back to 2015, 2016, people use it for everything.
Go back to when Harper was compared to Bush. Like, there's always, you always line them up. Look, campaigns are about whoever tells the story the best way wins. And if the Liberals, they'll have their work cut out for them. But if they tell that story and convince Canadians of that, and that's where the Conservatives need to be careful, particularly with the PPC type stuff, to make sure they don't play into that.
Greg, do you see, we got about a minute, do you see it as a viable strategy forward for the Liberals, like that there is advantage to be gained by a Trump nomination at minimum?
If you don't want to be wedged, avoid a wedge issue. If you don't want to be called a MAGA Republican, don't do things that are in lockstep with the Republicans. Recently, polling was not great for Joe Biden, but the midterms ended up being really good for the Democrats, and it's traced back to women and the issue of abortion. One of the things that I'd be watching for, if a conservative backbencher brings another abortion bill forward, you are asking for that comparison.
Right. Yeah. No, that's an interesting point. Mel, quick 10 seconds on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you stick to your issues, if you stick to your message of affordability and housing, you are less at a risk of having that comparison work. But if you have these small mistakes that regular people don't like, I think Pierre Poilievre is at risk for sure.
Okay, gang, we got to leave it there. I want to thank our political pulse panel, Greg MacEachern, Melanie Richer, Fred DeLorey. I love doing this at the end of the week, every week. It's been a lot of tough news this year, especially after October 7th, so there's always been a nice non-partisan bit of partisanship to close out the week. So thank you all for doing this, and thank you all for watching. I'm David Cochran. Thanks for watching this special edition, holiday edition of Power and Politics. More CBC News is just ahead, right here on CBC News Network.